Hi, so my name is Sally McMillan, and I will be talking about the psychoanalytic theory that was first presented by Sigmund Freud in the 19th century. So psychoanalytic theory traces to mental disorders, to some unresolved psychic or emotional conflict in the patient. So let's say, for example, the trauma could have occurred in childhood or as an adult. To Freud, conflict is inevitable within the personality of every human being. This is because personality is made up of three conflicting parts: the id, the ego, and the superego. So the id consists of the animal desires of sex and aggression, which all humans are born with, but the id is governed by the pleasure principle. So whatever it can get pleasure in, wherever, whenever, and from whoever, the id is going to try to get it with no regard to reason, logic, or morality. But then we have, on the other hand, the ego, which operates in accordance to the reality principle. Developed from ages 1 to 3, and it's learned this mainly by its primary caretaker, usually the parents. So the ego is rational and logical, able to deal with the environment realistically. But of course, therefore, the conflict with the id it handles the conflict with the id by setting limits on it, on how far it allows it to gratify itself. So it controls the id. So then the superego also seeks to restrain the id, but for moral reasons. Now we're on to the third one. It emerges in ages 3 to 6, when the child internalizes the parents or the primary caretaker in the form of ideals and restrictions. So the superego is roughly the same as what we traditionally know as the conscious. But in Freud's view, the superego is just completely as unreasonable as the id. So remember, we have the three. We have the id, we have the ego, and the superego. So while the id wants to have, among other things, sex with anybody, and it has an example of, let's say, for example, there's parents, the superego prohibits any form of sexual pleasure, including, let's say, for example, between a husband and wife. Being the only reasonable one, so then the ego has to be the one that balances and mediates between the id and the superego, trying to resolve the conflict between them. So the ego may try to persuade the id to stop being completely, animal-like, while pointing out that the id can still enjoy pleasure having sex with with one's spouse. But at the same time, the ego must try to persuade the superego to give up its total opposition to any form of pleasure seeking and let the id enjoy marital sex, while pointing out that such sex will not destroy the morality upheld by the superego, because, yes. So there are, of course, many other issues for the id and the superego to fight over, and each time the fight occurs, the ego has to be the one to settle it. Most of these conflicts take place during childhood, when all these new experiences are coming up. If the ego succeeds in resolving the conflict, the childhood grows up to be normal. But if the ego fails to resolve conflict, the unresolved conflict will develop into neurosis or psychosis. So the conflict is usually a very painful experience for the patient. The patient can repress it, pushing it into the unconscious side of the mind. The conflict will come up and it will manifest itself in the form of psychiatric symptoms such as anxiety, depression, or some form of compulsion. So to help cure the patient, the psychoanalyst must bring up the conflict out into the open so that the patient can understand and solve the problem. So let's go over some examples of psychoanalytic therapy. Let's say April broke up with Adam, and 3 months later went on a date with Mark. While at the restaurant, April accidentally calls Mark by Anna's name. While this could have just been a simple accident, psychoanalytic theory says that there's a deeper reason for April's slip. For example, she still has feelings for Mark, and in her mind, and he is on her mind, and therefore she called her new date by her old boyfriend's Mark's name. So we've all heard the expression of having a Freudian slip. So this would be an example of one. So let's say Mary's therapist believes that Mary's current relationship difficulties stem from the unstable relationship she had with her father while growing up. Another example is every time that the vehicle she's riding and stops suddenly, Mrs. Smith has a panic. She thinks this is because she was in a car accident when she was a child, and in each new situation, the fear of having another accident comes over her like waves. Lastly, and again, remember, these are just examples. So let's say Jacques' mother left his family when he was a child. Ever since then, he has a very difficult time trusting people because he has, he is afraid that they will abandon him. So these are all examples that the psychoanalytic therapist would be able to help and address, and hopefully reduce the suffering of the patient. So psychoanalytic theory, however, is not empirically testable. It is difficult because it's not possible to define and measure the key concepts of the theory, namely the id, the ego, and the superego. One has to rely on faith and accept that as real the same way as accepting ghosts are real. So once the concepts are accepted as real, though, their theory sounds convincing because there's enough logical reasoning and talking cure to support it.